The cold water hit my face like a slap, dripping down my cheeks as I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. I had only asked my son-in-law to help me carry the heavy boxes upstairs, but instead of words, he threw his glass right at me like I was nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Even my daughter pretended not to see what just happened. That night, as I wiped my face with trembling hands, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. What I did next will leave you speechless. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. It had been a simple request. I'd been struggling with the storage boxes in the living room for the better part of an hour, trying to figure out how to get them upstairs to the attic without straining my back. At 65, I wasn't as strong as I used to be, and these boxes were heavier than they looked. Marcus was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone while the evening news played on the television I'd bought. Sarah was in the kitchen, cleaning up after the dinner I'd cooked. It seemed reasonable to ask for help from a healthy 35-year-old man who lived in my house rent-free. "Marcus," I'd said, standing in the living room doorway with one of the boxes in my arms, "could you give me a hand with these? I need to get them upstairs." He'd looked up from his phone with an expression of mild annoyance, as if I'd interrupted something important. "Can't it wait until tomorrow?" "I'm relaxing." "It'll just take a few minutes," I'd replied, keeping my voice polite. "There are only 4 boxes." That's when his expression had changed. The mild annoyance transformed into something harder, more calculating. He'd set his phone aside and stood up slowly, deliberately. "You know what your problem is, Logan?" he'd said, walking toward the kitchen where I was now standing. "You think everyone exists to serve you. You think because this is your house, everyone should jump when you say jump." I'd been so surprised by the venom in his voice that I'd actually taken a step backward. "I was just asking for help." "You were demanding it," Marcus had corrected, following me into the kitchen where Sarah continued washing dishes, her movements becoming more rigid as she listened. "There's a difference." And that's when he'd reached for his water glass. The water was cold against my 65-year-old skin, each droplet trailing down like tears I refused to shed. I stood there in my own kitchen, watching Marcus wipe his hands on the dish towel as if nothing had happened. The glass lay shattered on the tile floor, pieces scattered like fragments of the respect I once thought existed in this house. My work shirt, the blue cotton one Margaret had bought me for my birthday 15 years ago, was now soaked and clinging to my chest. The fabric felt heavy and cold, like a shroud of disappointment. I could taste the metallic tang of shock in my mouth, could feel my heart hammering against my ribs with the irregular rhythm of a man who'd just discovered that safety was an illusion. "Sorry, Logan," he said, not looking sorry at all. His voice carried that familiar tone of manufactured politeness that made my skin crawl. My hands slipped. The lie hung in the air between us like smoke. His hands hadn't slipped. I'd watched him grip that glass with deliberate intent, watched him calculate the angle and force needed to ensure the water would hit my face squarely. The smirk playing at the corners of his mouth told me he was proud of his aim. What struck me most was the practiced nature of his movement. This wasn't the clumsy aggression of someone who'd lost control, but the calculated violence of someone who'd thought this through. The way he'd held the glass, the casual stance he'd maintained throughout the act, the immediate transition to false apology. It all spoke of someone who'd done this before. I turned to Sarah, my daughter, hoping to see shock or anger in her eyes. Instead, she busied herself loading the dishwasher, her movements sharp and deliberate. The clatter of plates filled the silence that should have been filled with her defending me. She had witnessed everything. The betrayal of her silence cut deeper than Marcus's aggression. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone after her mother died, the woman I'd sacrificed everything to protect and nurture. Watching her scrub a plate that was already clean while her father stood dripping and humiliated in his own kitchen felt like watching my heart break in real time. But there was something else in Sarah's posture, something I almost missed in my shock and disappointment. Her shoulders were rigid with tension, her movements too controlled, as if she were fighting some internal battle. It would be days before I realized that her silence wasn't betrayal, but strategy. "Those boxes aren't going anywhere tonight," I said quietly, bending to pick up the larger glass fragments. My knees protested, but I wasn't about to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing me struggle. "I'll handle them myself tomorrow." The boxes in question contained Margaret's china and some of my old Navy memorabilia, items I'd been meaning to move to the attic for months. They weren't particularly heavy, certainly nothing a healthy 35-year-old man couldn't manage easily, but asking for help had become an exercise in humiliation. Marcus leaned against the granite countertop, the countertop I'd saved 2 years to afford when Sarah first moved back home with her new husband. He crossed his arms, and I caught the flash of his expensive watch. The same watch he'd bought last month while claiming they were tight on money and couldn't contribute to groceries. "That's probably best, old man," he said, and the casualness in his voice made something cold settle in my chest. "You know how these old houses are. Narrow stairs, heavy boxes, wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." The phrase "old man" had become his favorite weapon, deployed with surgical precision whenever he wanted to remind me of my supposed inadequacy. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the timing of their delivery, the casual cruelty of reducing me to nothing more than my age. I finished cleaning up the glass in silence, each piece I picked up feeling heavier than the last. Marcus remained lounging against my counter, scrolling through his phone with the air of someone who owned the place. The light from his screen cast shadows across his face, making him look even more unfamiliar than the man who'd once called me Dad and helped me fix the back fence. That night I sat in my study with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The room smelled like old books and furniture polish, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. But tonight they felt suffocating. I stared at the family photos lining the shelves, pictures of Sarah's graduation, her wedding day, birthdays and holidays when we'd all been happy. The wedding photo hurt the most. Sarah in her white dress, radiant with happiness, flanked by Marcus and me in our matching tuxedos. I remembered how proud I'd felt that day, how grateful that my daughter had found someone who seemed to cherish her the way she deserved. But even then, Marcus had been working his manipulation. When I'd offered to pay for the wedding, Marcus had initially seemed grateful, but then began suggesting more and more expensive options. "Sarah deserves the best," he'd said, encouraging me to spend far more than I'd originally budgeted. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. You don't want her to look back and feel like her father was cheap on her wedding day, do you?" What had started as a modest $5,000 celebration had somehow ballooned into a $15,000 affair. Marcus had been full of helpful suggestions about upgrades and necessities that I'd felt pressured to approve. Looking back now, I realized it had been my first glimpse of his talent for manipulation, his ability to make me feel guilty for not spending money I couldn't afford. Now I wondered if even that wedding expense had been part of his plan, not to show generosity, but to drain my savings from the very beginning. Had he been calculating how much he could get me to spend, testing my financial limits while appearing to care about Sarah's happiness? The thought made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and self-recrimination. The water glass incident wasn't the first sign of disrespect. Over the past 6 months, Marcus had grown increasingly bold in his dismissiveness, the snide comments about my age, the way he'd changed the channel when I was watching television, the casual way he'd started making decisions about my house as if he lived here by right, rather than by my generosity. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing. Not a complaint or a rant, but a timeline. Dates, incidents, patterns. The disciplined part of my mind, the part that had served me well during my 40 years as a machinist and my earlier years in the Navy, began organizing the chaos of the past months into something coherent. Marcus thought he was dealing with a broken-down old man who'd accept whatever scraps of respect he chose to offer. He thought Sarah's silence meant approval. He thought my house, my savings, my life were resources he could exploit without consequence. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that used to energize me. But as I sat at my kitchen table with scrambled eggs growing cold on my plate, energy felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Marcus emerged from the guest bedroom, the room that had once been my workshop, wearing a silk bathrobe that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. The transformation of that space still stung. Where I'd once built birdhouses and repaired furniture, Marcus now stored his collection of expensive exercise equipment that he rarely used. The workshop had contained more than just tools and projects. It had held my connection to a simpler time, when problems could be solved with patience and skill, when broken things could be made whole again. "Morning, Logan," he said, opening my refrigerator and helping himself to the orange juice I'd bought yesterday. He drank straight from the container, something that would have earned him a sharp word just 6 months ago. Now I watched in silence as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The refrigerator itself told the story of our changing dynamic. Where it had once been organized according to my preferences, with my diabetes-friendly options clearly labeled and easily accessible, it now reflected Marcus's dietary demands. Expensive organic produce that I couldn't afford, imported cheeses that sat untouched until they spoiled, craft beer that took up half the refrigerator space. Sarah appeared in the doorway wearing her work clothes, her hair pulled back in the efficient ponytail she'd worn since childhood. She kissed Marcus on the cheek, a quick, dutiful gesture that looked more like muscle memory than affection. There had been a time when she'd greeted me first thing in the morning, when she'd ask about my plans for the day and share stories about her work. "I'll be late tonight," she told him, grabbing her keys from the hook by the door. "The Henderson account needs to be finished by tomorrow." The change in Sarah's schedule had been gradual, but noticeable. She who had once hurried home to share dinner and conversation now found reasons to extend her workday. I suspected she was avoiding the uncomfortable reality of our household dynamic. "No problem, babe," Marcus replied, already pulling bacon from my refrigerator. "Logan and I will have plenty of time to chat about those boxes." After Sarah left, Marcus settled into the chair across from me at my own kitchen table. He'd cooked enough bacon for one person, himself, and the grease-laden smell filled the air between us. I watched him cut his bacon with surgical precision, each movement calculated and deliberate. "We need to talk," he said, cutting into his food with the precision of someone accustomed to getting his way. "About boundaries." I set down my coffee cup slowly, buying myself time to think. "What kind of boundaries?" "Well, for starters, the way you asked for help yesterday was pretty demanding." Marcus chewed thoughtfully, as if he were discussing the weather rather than rewriting the events of the previous evening. "Sarah and I are stressed with work, and the last thing we need is you adding pressure." The audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. He was reframing his violence as my failure, his disrespect as my problem. I studied his face, looking for any sign that he recognized the absurdity of what he was saying. Instead, I only saw calculations. "I asked politely for help moving boxes," I said carefully. "I didn't demand anything." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. Logan, you're getting older, and sometimes older people remember things differently than they actually happened." There it was, the gaslighting dressed up as concern, the suggestion that my mind was failing, that my perception couldn't be trusted. "My memory is fine," I said evenly. "Is it, though?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, supremely confident. "Because from where I sat, you were pretty aggressive about those boxes, pretty insistent, and when someone gets that demand in someone else's house, this is my house." The words came out harder than I'd intended, cutting through his monologue like a blade. Marcus's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for the first time since the conversation began, he looked directly at me. "Your house," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "Interesting way to think about it." "It's not a way to think about it. It's a fact." Marcus set down his fork and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. I saw banking information, account numbers, balances, transaction histories. My banking information. "See, that's where things get complicated, Logan," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "Because according to this, I'm actually listed as a joint account holder on your primary checking account. And according to this," he scrolled to another screen, "I'm listed as a beneficiary on your savings account." My blood turned to ice water. I hadn't signed any papers giving Marcus access to my accounts. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, you signed it all right," Marcus said, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "Sarah can verify that. You were having one of your confused days, kept asking the same questions over and over. We were just trying to help you manage your finances more efficiently." The room tilted around me. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles going white against the wood grain. Confused days? I'd never had a confusing day. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. "You want to know what I can do?" Marcus asked, leaning forward with the confident smile of someone holding all the cards. "I can make your life very, very difficult. This house, your savings, your comfortable little retirement, it all depends on me being in a good mood." He stood up, leaving his dirty dishes on the table like a king abandoning his throne. At the kitchen doorway, he turned back with an afterthought. "Oh, and Logan? Those boxes you wanted help with, they can stay right where they are, permanently." That afternoon, I sat in my study surrounded by documents I hadn't looked at in months. Bank statements, insurance papers, the deed to my house, everything that proved this life belonged to me. My hands shook as I sorted through the papers, not from age, but from the adrenaline that comes with discovering you've been robbed in your own home. The house felt different now, like a jacket that no longer fit properly. I'd bought it 28 years ago, 6 months after Margaret died and left me alone with 8-year-old Sarah. The mortgage payments had been brutal on a machinist's salary, but I'd wanted Sarah to have stability, a place that was unquestionably ours. The purchase had required sacrifices that younger people today couldn't imagine. Double shifts for months, canceled vacations, a diet consisting primarily of whatever was on sale at the grocery store. But every sacrifice had been worth it when I'd handed that deed to the lawyer and known that Sarah would never be homeless. I remembered those early years with painful clarity. Sarah cried herself to sleep for weeks, asking when Mommy was coming home. Me learning to braid hair from YouTube videos, burning dinner more nights than I cared to count, falling asleep in chairs while helping with homework. The house had been our fortress against a world that suddenly felt too big and too dangerous. By the time Sarah graduated high school, every room held memories we'd built together. Her first day of school pictures lined the hallway like a timeline of our shared victory over grief. Growth marks on the doorframe of her bedroom tracked her transformation from a grieving little girl to a confident young woman. When she'd brought Marcus home 3 years ago, I'd been cautiously optimistic. He was polite, well-dressed, and seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's happiness. He'd asked thoughtful questions about my work, complimented Margaret's rose garden that I still maintained, and even helped me repair the back fence without being asked. "He's good for her, Dad," Sarah had said after that first weekend visit. "He makes me feel safe." But temporary had stretched into permanent. And somewhere along the way, Marcus had stopped asking permission and started taking control. The erosion had been so gradual, I'd barely noticed it happening. My favorite chair in the living room had become Marcus's office space. The garage where I'd once puttered with woodworking projects had been converted to storage for his expensive exercise equipment. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account, dreading what I might find. The login worked. That was something at least. But what I saw on the screen made my stomach drop. Withdrawals I didn't remember making. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. A joint account holder listed as Marcus Thompson with full access privileges. But I hadn't made those changes. I would have remembered something that significant. I called the bank's customer service line, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waded through the hold music. When a representative finally answered, I explained my situation as calmly as I could manage. "Mr. Scott, I show that these changes were made in person at our downtown branch. the representative said after reviewing my account. "You came in with your son-in-law, and our records show you signed all the necessary paperwork." "I never went to your downtown branch," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I would remember that." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. Either my memory was failing in ways that terrified me, or Marcus had somehow managed to forge my signature and identity well enough to fool a bank. Given the calculating look I'd seen in his eyes that morning, I was beginning to suspect which option was more likely. The sound of Sarah's car in the driveway broke through my thoughts. I quickly closed the laptop and shuffled the papers back into their folders, not ready to involve her in suspicions I couldn't yet prove. But as I listened to her key in the lock, followed by the murmur of voices in the kitchen, I made a decision. Whatever was happening in my house, whatever game Marcus was playing with my life and my family, it was going to stop. The old man he thought he was manipulating didn't exist. Logan Scott, who'd served 6 years in the Navy, who'd worked double shifts for decades to build a life for his daughter, who'd learned to be both father and mother after Margaret died. That man was still here, and that man had just declared war. I started my investigation the way I'd learned to approach problems in the Navy, methodically, quietly, and with attention to details others might miss. The first thing I needed was documentation, real evidence that couldn't be dismissed as the confusion of an aging mind. At 3 a.m, while Marcus and Sarah slept, I crept down to my study and began photographing every financial document I could find. Bank statements, credit card bills, insurance policies, anything that might reveal the scope of Marcus's infiltration into my life. The camera flash was disabled on my phone, but each click of the shutter sounded deafeningly loud in the silent house. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Over the past 6 months, there had been a systematic transfer of my assets into accounts where Marcus had access. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, but in small, regular amounts that could be explained away as normal expenses or pre-authorized transfers. The most chilling discovery was a life insurance policy I didn't remember signing. It was in my name, with a substantial death benefit, and Marcus was listed as the primary beneficiary. According to the documentation, I'd signed it during a financial planning session at an insurance office downtown. I'd never been to any financial planning session. The realization sent ice water through my veins as I understood the implications. This wasn't just theft, it was preparation for something much worse. By the 4th night of my clandestine research, I'd accumulated enough evidence to fill a manila folder. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed help from someone Marcus couldn't manipulate or intimidate, someone who understood the legal implications of what I was discovering. That's when I remembered Michael Sullivan. Mike and I had served together on the USS Ranger 45 years ago. We'd lost touch after discharge, but I'd heard through mutual friends that he'd become a lawyer specializing in elder fraud. A quick internet search confirmed he was still practicing in the city, just 2 hours away. I called his office during Sarah's work hours, when Marcus was typically out running errands or meeting with his mysterious business contacts. Logan Scott. Mike's voice carried the same warmth I remembered from our Navy days, though it was weathered now by decades and experience. "I'll be damned. How long has it been?" "Too long," I admitted. "Mike, I need help. I think my son-in-law is stealing from me, and I don't know how to prove it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Mike spoke again, his voice had shifted into professional mode. "Tell me everything." I spent the next hour walking Mike through my discoveries. He asked precise questions about dates, amounts, and procedures. When I described the bank's insistence that I'd personally authorized the account changes, he made a sound that was part grunt, part growl. "This is a classic case of financial elder abuse," he said when I finished. "The gradual erosion of autonomy, the gaslighting about your memory, the systematic transfer of assets, it's textbook. The fact that he's doing it while living in your house makes it even more brazen." "What can I do about it?" "First, we need to secure your accounts before he can do any more damage. Second, We need to document everything he's already taken. If he's forged your signature on legal documents, that's fraud, plain and simple." "What about Sarah?" I asked the question I'd been dreading. "She's been living here too. She might have signed things or witnessed things." Mike's silence stretched long enough to make me uncomfortable. "Logan, I have to ask this directly. Do you think your daughter is involved?" I thought about Sarah's behavior over the past weeks. The way she'd avoided eye contact after the water glass incident. The way she'd seemed increasingly distant, almost guilty. But I also remembered the little girl who'd cried in my arms after her mother died. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm going to find out." After I hung up with Mike, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Marcus had been operating under the assumption that I was isolated, helpless, too old or too confused to fight back effectively. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. That evening I watched Marcus and Sarah during dinner with new eyes. They sat close together, but their conversation felt scripted, almost performative. Sarah asked about my day in the overly bright tone people use when they're trying too hard to appear normal. But I also noticed things that Marcus missed. The way Sarah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she looked at him. The way she tensed slightly when he put his hand on her shoulder. The way she excused herself from the table as soon as politely possible. After they'd both retreated to their respective corners of my house, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I was going to confront Sarah directly, but not in the way Marcus might expect. I waited until I heard the shower running in the master bathroom, indicating Marcus was occupied for at least 20 minutes. Then I knocked softly on Sarah's bedroom door. "Come in, Dad," she called, and something in her voice, a note of relief, perhaps, gave me hope. Sarah was sitting on the bed with her laptop, but she closed it when I entered. The room looked like a hotel suite where someone had been living temporarily for too long. "We need to talk," I said, settling into the chair by her dresser. "And we need to talk honestly." Sarah's face went very still. For a moment, she looked exactly like her mother had during difficult conversations, braced for impact, but determined to face whatever was coming. "I know, Dad," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for you to ask." Those 6 words changed everything. The relief in her voice, the way her shoulders sagged as if she'd been carrying a tremendous weight. It told me everything I needed to know about whose side she was really on. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About the financial stuff? I started suspecting about 2 months ago." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, mindful of the shower still running down the hall. "What kind of person he really is?" "Much longer than that." She reached under her mattress and pulled out a manila envelope that looked remarkably similar to the one I'd been filling with evidence. But when she opened it, I saw that her collection was far more comprehensive than mine. Photographs of documents, screenshots of text messages, audio recordings on her phone, a detailed timeline of Marcus's behavior patterns. "Sarah," I breathed, staring at the evidence she'd compiled. "How did you—" "I'm an accountant, Dad," she said with a ghost of her old smile. "I notice when numbers don't add up, and I notice when the man I married starts treating my father like garbage." The shower shut off down the hall, and Sarah quickly returned the envelope to its hiding place. But before she did, she pulled out one final item, a small digital recorder. "Tomorrow morning," she whispered, pressing the device into my hands, "when he starts his usual intimidation routine, turn this on. We're going to need his confession on record." As I returned to my own room with the recorder hidden in my pocket, I realized that Marcus had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that Sarah's silence meant compliance, that her failure to defend me publicly meant she agreed with his treatment of me. Instead, she'd been conducting her own investigation, building her own case, and waiting for the right moment to act. Tomorrow morning, Marcus was going to discover that he hadn't been manipulating one confused old man and his naive daughter. He'd been up against a team. The next morning unfolded with the careful precision of a military operation. Sarah left for work at her usual time, but not before catching my eye and giving an almost imperceptible nod toward my shirt pocket where the recorder was hidden. We had spent the previous evening rehearsing this moment, anticipating Marcus's likely responses and preparing for every contingency we could imagine. Marcus emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, already dressed in one of his expensive suits and carrying himself with the swagger of a man who believed he owned everything he surveyed. His confidence was absolute, the kind of certainty that comes from months of successful manipulation. "Morning, Logan," he said, helping himself to coffee from the pot I'd made. He didn't offer to pour me a cup, though I was sitting right there at the kitchen table. In his mind, I existed to serve his convenience, not the other way around. "Well enough," I replied, my finger finding the recorder's power button through my shirt fabric. The device was smaller than a matchbox, but it felt enormous against my chest. "You?" "Like a baby," Marcus said, settling into what had become his customary seat across from me. "You know what I love about this house? How quiet it is. Really gives a man time to think about the future." His phone buzzed against the table, displaying what appeared to be a text message. I caught a glimpse of the sender's name, real estate agent, before he quickly turned the device face down. I pressed the button and felt the tiny device begin recording. "What kind of future are you thinking about?" Marcus's smile was the kind predators use when they're absolutely certain their prey can't escape. "Well, I've been doing some research on retirement communities. Really nice places, full-time care, activities for people your age. I think it might be time for you to consider making a transition." "A transition?" "Come on, Logan. You're 65 years old, living alone in this big house. This place is too much for someone in your condition to handle." "My condition?" "Your memory issues," Marcus said with exaggerated patience. "The confusion, the forgetfulness. Sarah and I have been talking, and we're both concerned about your ability to live independently." I kept my voice level, letting him dig his own grave with words. I wasn't aware I had memory issues. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a notes app. "Well, there was last Tuesday when you forgot you'd already taken your medication, and last weekend when you couldn't remember having lunch with the neighbors, and of course, all those financial documents you signed but don't remember signing." Each lie fell from his lips with practiced ease. The medication incident had never happened. The lunch with neighbors had been canceled due to rain, and the financial documents remained the crux of everything. "About those documents," I said carefully, "I'd like to review them again." "Oh, Logan." Marcus's sigh was theatrical. "We've been through this. Going over it again and again isn't going to change reality. Humor me." Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of irritation breaking through his manufactured concern. "I don't think that's a good idea. These episodes where you question things that have already been settled, they're exactly the kind of symptoms the doctors warned us about." "What doctors?" "The ones Sarah took you to see last month," Marcus said smoothly. "Surely you remember Dr. Patterson, the geriatrician?" I'd never seen any Dr. Patterson. I'd never been to a geriatrician. "I'd like to call Dr. Patterson's office," I said. "Get copies of my medical records." "No," I said firmly. "I'd like to continue." The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. Marcus looked up from his phone, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw his mask slip completely. "You'd like to continue?" he repeated slowly. "You'd like to continue questioning my honesty, questioning Sarah's judgment, questioning the doctors who are trying to help you." "I'm questioning the stories you're telling me, yes." Marcus set his phone down with deliberate precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that made the kitchen feel 10 degrees colder. "Let me be very clear about something, old man. This house, your bank accounts, your entire comfortable little life, it all exists because Sarah and I allow it to exist. You signed those documents because you were confused and needed guidance. You don't remember the doctors because your memory is failing, and if you keep pushing this nonsense about being some kind of victim, you're going to find out exactly how uncomfortable your golden years can become." The threat was naked now, stripped of all pretense. Marcus leaned forward, his expensive cologne unable to mask the stench of greed and cruelty. "You want to know what I can do?" he continued. "I can have you declared mentally incompetent. I can have you committed to a state facility where the food is terrible and the staff doesn't give a damn about your dignity. I can make sure you never see Sarah again except through supervised visits." "Is that a threat, Marcus?" "It's a promise," he said, "unless you start showing some gratitude for everything Sarah and I have done for you." The front door opened and closed, followed by the sound of heels clicking across the hardwood floor. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, home from work earlier than usual, still wearing her business suit but carrying herself differently than she had in weeks. "Hi, honey," Marcus said, his voice instantly shifting back to its familiar warmth. "You're home early." "I am," Sarah agreed, but she wasn't looking at Marcus. Her eyes were fixed on me, and I saw a question in them that I answered with the slightest nod. "Actually," Sarah continued, setting her purse down on the counter with deliberate precision, "I'm home early because I wanted to be here for this conversation." Marcus frowned, probably wondering how much of his threats she'd overheard. "What conversation?" "The one where you explained to both of us exactly how you've been stealing from my father." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming and the clock ticking on the wall. Marcus stared at Sarah as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Sarah, honey, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the forged signatures," Sarah said calmly, pulling out her phone and setting it on the counter. "I'm talking about the fake medical appointments. I'm talking about the systematic theft of my father's assets over the past 6 months." Marcus's face went through a fascinating series of changes: confusion, concern, anger, and finally, calculation. "Sweetheart, I think you're having some kind of episode." "I've been recording our conversations for weeks, Marcus," Sarah interrupted. "I have documentation of every lie you've told, every threat you've made, every attempt to gaslight both me and my father." The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly I thought he might faint. "You've been recording me?" "I've been protecting my family," Sarah corrected, "which is something I should have started doing the first time you showed disrespect to the man who raised me." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. You're both insane. I've been trying to help this family." "Stop," I said quietly, and something in my voice cut through his growing hysteria. I reached into my shirt pocket and placed the recorder on the table between us. "It's over, Marcus." Marcus looked from the recorder to Sarah to me, and I watched him realize that every word of the past 30 minutes had been captured. "You can't use that," he said desperately. "I didn't consent to being recorded." "Actually," Sarah said, consulting something on her phone, "in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. And since Dad and I both consented to recording you threatening him in his own home, we're completely within our legal rights." The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the silence belonged to us. Marcus had run out of words, out of threats, out of the confidence that had carried him through months of systematic abuse. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, standing up slowly. "You're going to pack your things. You're going to return every cent you've stolen from me, and you're going to get out of my house. And if you don't," Sarah added, "we're going to take our recordings, our documentation, and our testimony to the police, the district attorney, and anyone else who might be interested in prosecuting elder fraud." Marcus opened his mouth one more time, but nothing came out. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. I reached over and turned off the recorder, then looked at my daughter. Sarah was crying, but she was also smiling, and for the first time in months, she looked like the strong, brilliant woman I'd raised her to be. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I let it go on as long as I did." I stood up and wrapped my arms around her, feeling like we were both exactly where we belonged. "You protected us both," I said into her hair. "That's all that matters now." And there you have it, what I did next that I promised would leave you speechless. The decision I made that night, wiping my face with trembling hands, had indeed changed both our lives forever. The next 3 days passed in a blur of legal paperwork, phone calls, and the surreal experience of reclaiming my own life. Mike Sullivan drove down from the city to help us navigate the formal process of reporting Marcus's crimes and reversing the financial damage he'd inflicted. His presence brought a sense of professional competence that I found deeply reassuring, a reminder that there were still systems in place to protect people like me from predators like Marcus. Mike arrived with a briefcase full of legal documents and a laptop computer that seemed to contain everything we needed to untangle the web of financial fraud Marcus had created over the past months. His first action was to contact my bank and place fraud alerts on all my accounts, freezing any transactions that required Marcus's authorization. The banker we spoke with expressed genuine surprise at the complexity and sophistication of the fraud, commenting that she'd never seen such an elaborate operation targeting an individual rather than a business or institution. The legal process proved more complicated than I'd initially expected, but also more thorough than I'd dared to hope. Each fraudulent transaction had to be documented separately, with evidence provided to prove that I hadn't authorized the transfer of funds. The life insurance policy required a separate investigation involving handwriting experts who would analyze the signature to prove forgery. Even the mortgage refinancing Marcus had mentioned would need to be examined by real estate attorneys to determine its legitimacy and potential impact on my property ownership. "You're lucky," Mike told us as we sat in my study, surrounded by documents that would eventually restore my control over my own accounts. Most elder fraud cases take months to unravel, if they can be unraveled at all. The fact that you both documented everything so thoroughly makes this much cleaner. His briefcase was filled with forms and affidavits, each one representing another step toward justice and restitution, another nail in the coffin of Marcus's carefully constructed deception. Sarah had taken a week off work to help coordinate the legal response. Watching her in action, calling banks, scheduling appointments, organizing evidence with the precision she brought to her accounting work, reminded me of all the reasons I was proud to be her father. Marcus had left quietly on the second day, loading his expensive belongings into a rental truck while Sarah and I watched from the kitchen window. He didn't try to argue or negotiate. The recordings we'd made had stripped away his ability to manipulate the narrative. Before driving away, he'd left an envelope on the front porch containing signed documentation transferring back the assets he could immediately return. It wasn't everything. Some of the money he'd stolen had apparently been lost in bad investments and what Mike diplomatically called lifestyle expenses. But it was enough to secure my immediate future. The psychological victory was more valuable than the financial recovery. "The district attorney's office is very interested in prosecuting this case," Mike told us during his final visit. "Financial elder abuse is a growing problem, and they want to send a message that it won't be tolerated. Based on the evidence we've compiled, Marcus is looking at multiple felony charges: fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and possibly racketeering if they can prove this was part of a larger pattern." I found myself oddly uninterested in Marcus's ultimate fate, though the knowledge that he would face serious consequences brought a measure of satisfaction. The man who'd thrown water in my face, who'd threatened to have me declared incompetent, who'd tried to steal the security I'd spent 40 years building, that man was gone from my life. The fact that he'd likely spend the next several years in prison was simply justice being served. What mattered was the quiet that had returned to my house. The kind of quiet that came from safety rather than fear, from peace rather than tension. On the fourth evening after Marcus's departure, Sarah and I sat in the living room with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine she'd brought home from work. The boxes that had started this entire crisis were still stacked in the corner, waiting to be moved to the attic storage, but somehow they no longer seemed urgent. "I keep thinking about Mom," Sarah said, twirling lo mein around her chopsticks with the skill she'd developed during countless childhood dinners when I'd been too tired to cook. About what she would have thought of all this. I considered the question while watching steam rise from my coffee cup. Margaret had been the family diplomat, the one who could find common ground with anyone and see the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. But she'd also been fiercely protective of the people she loved. "I think she would have been proud of how you handled yourself," I said finally. "The way you gathered evidence, the way you protected both of us while making Marcus think he was getting away with it. That took courage and intelligence." "I was so scared I was wrong," Sarah admitted. "What if I'd been imagining things? What if he really was just trying to help and I was being paranoid?" "But you weren't wrong." "But I could have been. And the whole time I was watching him treat you terribly and doing nothing to stop it." I set down my coffee and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. At 28, she had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, but she'd developed her own strength through years of navigating a world that had taken her mother too early and asked her to grow up too fast. "You did exactly the right thing," I told her. "If you'd confronted him without evidence, he would have found a way to turn it around on both of us. This way, we had everything we needed to stop him permanently." Sarah nodded, but I could see she was still processing the events of the past week. "I keep thinking about the moment when I walked in and heard him threatening you. I was so angry I could barely think straight. You seemed very calm." "I was dying inside," she laughed, the sound carrying equal parts relief and residual stress. "I kept thinking, don't mess this up, Sarah. You get one chance to catch him in his own lies." We finished dinner in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes when two people have been through something difficult together and emerged stronger on the other side. The house felt like ours again, not just mine, not just hers, but ours in the way it had been when she was growing up and we were figuring out how to be a family without Margaret. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked as we cleared away the takeout containers. "Now we move those boxes upstairs," I said, gesturing toward the corner where they'd been sitting for over a week. "Together." Sarah grinned, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from her since before Marcus had entered our lives. "Deal, but I'm carrying the heavy ones. We'll see about that." As we prepared for bed that night, I realized that Marcus had given us something valuable, though not in the way he'd intended. He'd reminded us that family isn't just about blood or obligation, but about choosing to protect and support each other when the world gets difficult. He'd also reminded me that I wasn't as powerless as I'd sometimes felt in recent years. At 65, I might not have the physical strength I'd possessed in my 20s, but I had something more valuable: the wisdom to recognize a threat, the patience to gather evidence, and the strategic thinking to neutralize an enemy without destroying myself in the process. Most importantly, he'd reminded me that Sarah had grown into exactly the kind of woman her mother and I had hoped she'd become, strong enough to stand up to bullies, smart enough to outthink manipulators, and loyal enough to risk her own comfort to protect the people she loved. The water glass incident that had started this entire crisis seemed like it had happened months ago rather than days. But as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my bedroom in my house, with my daughter safe down the hall, I could still remember the shock of that cold water hitting my face. The difference was that now, instead of humiliation, the memory filled me with satisfaction, because that moment of disrespect had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Marcus's cruelty had awakened something in both Sarah and me that had been dormant for too long. The refusal to accept abuse, the determination to fight back, and the knowledge that we were stronger together than anyone who tried to tear us apart. Marcus would never forget what happened in this kitchen, just as I would never forget the lesson he'd inadvertently taught me. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who give you the greatest opportunity to prove them wrong. The man who'd called me a confused old man was now facing federal charges, while the confused old man was sleeping peacefully in his own house, surrounded by the family and security he'd fought to protect. The irony was perfect. Marcus had thrown water at me to show his dominance, to demonstrate that I was powerless in my own home. Instead, that single act of cruelty had set in motion the very investigation that would destroy him completely. He'd literally thrown away his freedom along with that glass of water. The man who'd called me a confused old man was now facing federal charges, while the confused old man was sleeping peacefully in his own house, surrounded by the family and security he'd fought to protect. If you enjoyed this story about standing up for yourself and protecting family, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, justice, and the bonds that really matter. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to reclaim your power and protect the people you love.